My fiancé sold me to the Beast Duke. He was shocked when I became his Duchess. They said the beast of Highspire devoured men whole. No one mentioned he did it mechanically. Freya Clarke had expected many things at the gates of Highspire Abbey. The stench of rot, perhaps, or the low animal sound of something that had long forgotten it was human. She had packed her fears neatly beside her father's tools, folded them flat and told herself they were practical, not personal. She was here to pay a debt. Nothing more. What she had not expected was the sound. It reached her before the gates even parted, a rhythmic, pressurized exhale, like the lungs of the building itself were working too hard to keep something alive. Clink. Hiss. Clink. Hiss. She knew that sound. Every watchmaker's daughter did. That was the sound of a mechanism under strain. Of parts doing the work they were never designed to sustain. The drawing room was cold and cathedral high, lit amber by gas lamps that threw long shadows across walls of iron-fitted stone. A butler, thin as a rail spike, had led her in without a word and disappeared just as quietly, leaving her alone with the silhouette by the far window. 7 feet, if it was an inch. Brass and dark steel, fitted together with a kind of terrible precision that made her fingers itch and her chest tighten in equal measure. It stood with its back to her, massive shoulders faintly trembling with each hydraulic breath, watching the valley below as though it had been standing there long enough to see the seasons change and find them all disappointing. This was the Iron Duke. Nathan Thomas, Lord of Highspire, the Beast. Freya's hand found the hidden pocket of her corset, the slim row of screwdrivers she'd sewn there the night Julian signed her life away, and she held very still. Because she had repaired enough clocks in her 22 years to know, without a shadow of doubt, what she was truly looking at. Not a monster. A cage. And somewhere inside all that brass and cruelty of engineering, something human was still breathing. Welcome to Forbidden Diaries. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Julian Vane had beautiful hands for a man who dealt in ruin. Freya had noticed that years ago, when he'd first come to court her, long fingers, clean nails, the kind of hands that had never once closed around a wrench or burned themselves on a soldering iron. She used to think them elegant. Now, watching those same hands spread her father's debt ledgers across the kitchen table like a merchant laying out a corpse, she thought them obscene. It's quite simple, darling. He didn't look up. Your father borrowed against the shop. Then against the inventory. Then against things a man of pride ought never to borrow against. A pause, a small smile at something in the columns. He has a gift for accumulation, I'll grant him that. Across the room, Edmund Clarke sat in his chair by the cold hearth, smaller than she remembered, as though debt had taken something structural out of him. He did not meet her eyes. How much? Freya asked. More than this shop will ever produce. Julian finally looked up. But I am a generous man. She said nothing. Generosity, from Julian, was always a door with a lock on the wrong side. He slid a single document across the table. The letterhead bore a crest she didn't recognize. A gear encircled by iron laurels, stamped beneath the words Highspire Abbey. The Duke requires someone with mechanical aptitude. Someone who can manage the more delicate aspects of his condition. Julian's smile didn't waver. I immediately thought of you. You're selling me. I'm resolving a debt. He straightened his cuffs. Your father's ledgers clear the morning you arrive at Highspire. His shop, his hands, his health, all restored to him, untouched. The smile again, thin as a blade. You have my word. His word. The same word that had strung her father along for 3 years while the interest quietly compounded like rot in a wall. Freya looked at her father. He was staring into the empty grate, jaw tight, and she understood, with the specific heartbreak of a daughter who has always known too much, that he had already agreed. That this conversation was not a negotiation. It was a notification. She picked up the document. When do I leave? They gave her a room that overlooked the courtyard, which meant she fell asleep to the sound of steam venting from pipes she couldn't see and woke, hours later, to the realization that she hadn't fallen asleep at all. The Abbey had a pulse. That was the only way to describe it, a low, rhythmic pressure that moved through the walls and up through the floorboards and settled somewhere behind her sternum like a second heartbeat that wasn't hers. Clink. Hiss. Clink. Hiss. She lay in the dark and listened to it and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who had grown up inside a workshop, that the building had been retrofitted around a single functioning machine. Around him. She found the dining room by accident, following a corridor that bent twice where it should have run straight. The long table was set for one, a single chair, a single lamp, a covered plate going cold at the head. The Iron Duke stood at the far end of the room, facing the unlit fireplace, hands clasped behind his back with the careful stillness of a man who has learned that stillness costs less than movement. He didn't turn when she entered. "You're not eating," Freya said, because silence had never suited her and she was too tired for pretense. A long pause. When he spoke, his voice came through a small brass resonator fitted at the collar of the suit, flattened, slightly delayed, like sound arriving from another room. "No, the plate hasn't been touched. It won't be." She looked at the suit more carefully in the low light. No seam at the jaw. No hinge at the wrist flexible enough to raise a fork. The gauntlets were engineering achievements, she could see that plainly, but they were not made for the fine motor delicacy of feeding oneself. They were made for endurance. For permanence. "You can't remove it," she said. Not a question. Another pause, longer this time. "Not without consequence." "And sleeping." The resonator produced something that might, in a different life, have been a quiet, humorless laugh. "What you heard last night, that was sleeping, Miss Clarke." Freya stood in the amber half-light and looked at the cold plate and the motionless man and felt something shift inside her. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to recognition. They told her the joint cleaning was daily work. The engineers, 3 of them, grey-coated and precise, who moved through the abbey like men who owned it, left her a kit the first morning, soft bristled brushes, a small canister of lubricant, a cloth that smelled faintly of copper. They demonstrated the motions with the detached efficiency of men instructing a housemaid on silverware, then left without answering a single question she asked. So she learned by touch. The suit had a language, she discovered. A vocabulary of tension and resistance that revealed itself slowly under patient hands. This joint ran hot. That coupling vibrated at odd intervals, like a word repeated until it loses meaning. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her, starting from the base and moving upward, cataloguing what she found the way other women catalogued grievances. It was at the left shoulder, a deep, recessed junction where 3 separate pressure lines converged in a configuration she didn't yet fully understand, that the Duke spoke. Not through the resonator. The resonator produced his managed voice, the one she'd already learned to read, measured, remote, stripped of anything a listener could hold on to. This was different. This came from inside the brass itself, muffled and close, the way sound travels through a wall when someone on the other side forgets to keep quiet. "You should leave Highspire." Freya's brush stilled. She didn't pull back. "Miss Clarke." Closer now. Unfiltered. A real voice, low and roughened at the edges, like leather worn down to its honest grain. "Whatever Vane told you this position was, it isn't that." "He told me very little," she said, resuming her work with deliberate calm. "I found that's usually informative in itself." She reached out and placed her fingers over the sensor array on the back of his left hand, a cluster of fine copper filaments embedded beneath a plate of thinner brass, designed, the blueprints had noted, to transmit basic tactile information to the nerve endings beneath. She pressed, gently and deliberately, the way she pressed a mainspring to test its responsiveness. The suit stilled completely. "You felt that," she said. "Yes." Quieter than she'd heard him. Unguarded in a way that cost him something. She didn't move her hand. "Then they haven't damaged the sensors. Whatever else they've done, that still works." The silence between them shifted, lost its careful architecture and became something more honest. Outside, the valley was dark and the abbey breathed its slow mechanical breath, and in the workshop the candle threw their shadows long across the original blueprints of a life someone had tried very hard to bury. "Julian was there," Nathan said at last. "The night of the explosion. He was the only one who knew which valve to open." A beat. "He was also the first to recommend Aldrin's team for my recovery." Freya looked at the copper sensors beneath her fingertips and said nothing. She didn't need to. She heard it before she saw it. A sound she hadn't encountered in all her weeks of learning the Abbey's vocabulary, not the steady clink-hiss of normal function but something arrhythmic and desperate, a stuttering percussion like a clock whose mainspring has finally, catastrophically, been wound past its tolerance. She was halfway down the corridor before she was fully awake. Her father's tools already in her hand from the habit she developed of sleeping with them close. Nathan was in the workshop, standing very still in the way she'd learned meant the opposite of calm. The suit's pressure gauges, she could read them fluently now, were climbing past every threshold she'd mapped in her ledger. The restraint mechanisms at his ribs were cycling in irregular spasms, tightening and failing to release, tightening again. Each cycle a fraction worse than the last. "How long?" she said, already moving toward him. "An hour." The resonator's voice was strained, the signal breaking at the edges. Perhaps less. She went for the primary coupling at the left thoracic plate and found Audran already there, grey coat immaculate, hands clasped behind his back with the composure of a man attending a scheduled appointment. Hess stood at the gauges. The third engineer by the door. None of them were working. "Step aside," Freya said. Audran regarded her with the patient condescension of someone who has never once been wrong in his own estimation. "Miss Clarke, this is a medical matter beyond your—" "Step aside. The suit's deterioration is a natural progression." His voice was smooth and certain and utterly without shame. "His Grace's condition has always been terminal. We are simply allowing nature to—" "Nature." The word came out of her very quietly. "You wound these springs. I watched you. I recorded every reading." She held up the ledger. "This isn't nature. This is arithmetic." Something moved behind Audran's eyes, a brief recalculation, quickly smoothed over. He didn't step aside. The suit spasmed again. Nathan made no sound, which was somehow worse than any sound he could have made. Freya looked at the 3 grey coats and the locked door and the climbing gauges and made the only reasonable assessment available to her. She was going to have to do this without their help. She opened her kit and got to work. She worked from the blueprint she'd memorized and the knowledge she'd built with her hands over weeks of patient, deliberate learning. Every joint, every coupling, every pressure line mapped in her mind with the same clarity her father had taught her to hold a clock's architecture. Not a mechanism to be forced. A language to be spoken correctly or not at all. The thoracic restraints first. She found the release sequence buried 3 layers deep beneath a panel Audran's team had rebolted with the wrong gauge screws. A small cruelty, almost petty, that told her everything about the kind of men they were. She stripped them in 40 seconds. The gauges dropped fractionally. Nathan exhaled, through the brass, raw and unmediated. "Talk to me," she said. Hands already moving to the left shoulder coupling. "I'm here." His real voice, not the resonator. Close and present and effortful. "Stay there." The engineers hadn't moved. She'd stopped accounting for them entirely, which was its own kind of answer about who held the power in this room. She was deep inside the ribcage assembly, both hands working blind on a pressure valve the blueprints had marked as critical, when she heard the doors. Not the workshop doors, the Abbey's main entrance, thrown open with the particular authority of a man who has decided he is arriving to collect something already his. Footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, elegant. She knew that cadence. Julian appeared in the doorway in traveling clothes, his beautiful hands resting easily at his sides, taking in the scene with an expression of rehearsed grief already arranged on his face. His eyes moved from the engineers to the suit to Freya, and something behind them recalculated with the same cold efficiency she'd seen in Audran. "I came as soon as I heard of the deterioration," he said softly. "I thought someone should be here for the end." "How considerate," Freya said, and returned her attention to the valve. "Freya." His voice shifted, a warning dressed as tenderness. "Step away from the suit." The valve released. The primary restraint at the sternum disengaged with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and the front plate of the brass shell swung open and Nathan Thomas, pale, diminished, and absolutely, undeniably alive, stepped forward into the candlelight. Julian's rehearsed grief faltered. Freya set down her tools and stood up straight. "He doesn't need a widow," she said. "Try again." He stood like a man relearning a language he'd once been fluent in. Each breath careful, deliberate, not from weakness entirely, but from the particular astonishment of a person discovering that a thing they'd been told was impossible had simply been waiting for someone to stop believing the people doing the telling. Freya stayed close without hovering, the way she'd learned to work around delicate mechanisms, present but not interfering, letting the thing find its own equilibrium. A sharp exhale, not through the resonator, just breath, human and unmediated, fogging faintly against the interior brass. "There are men in this abbey who do not want its problems solved. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She moved the brush in a slow arc. "I'm beginning to." The silence stretched and pressurized itself the way silences do when someone is deciding how much truth to spend. "Run," he said finally, barely above a whisper, "before the steam takes you." Freya set down the brush, picked up the lubricant, kept working. "Tell me," she said quietly, "what the steam took from you." She almost missed it. That was the part that stayed with her afterward. How close she came to simply not seeing it, how nearly the whole thing passed itself off as routine. The engineers arrived each afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, the way bad news always arrives, punctually and without apology. They brought their own kit. They did not invite observation. But Freya had her father's habit of watching hands. She positioned herself by the window on the fourth day, a ledger open in her lap as though she were taking inventory, and she watched. Grey-coated Aldrin worked the left side of the torso. Smaller, quieter Hess took the legs. The third, she had not yet learned his name, only his habit of standing slightly apart, like a man rehearsing innocence. Monitored the pressure gauges mounted on the suit's spine and called out numbers the others acknowledged with nods. It looked like maintenance. It had the grammar of maintenance, the tools, the sequence, the professional silence. But the numbers were wrong. She knew pressure calibration. Her father's most delicate clocks operated on the same principle, springs wound to precise tolerances, each one a careful negotiation between tension and function. Wind too loose and the mechanism fails. Wind too tight and you don't fix anything. You just defer the braking. The gauges on the suit's spine crept upward with each session. Incrementally, deliberately. Small enough to attribute to drift if you weren't paying attention, significant enough to matter enormously if you were. She cross-referenced against the readings she'd quietly begun recording in the back pages of the ledger, behind the inventory columns where no one would think to look. 3 sessions. 3 consistent increases. Always the same 3 men. Always the same measured, unhurried tightening, not of fittings that needed tightening, but of the deep restraint mechanisms she'd found at the shoulder, the hip, the base of the ribcage. The places that would hurt most. The places that would, given enough time, make breathing a negotiation he was destined to lose. That evening she sat with a ledger in her lap and the Abbey's pulse moving through the floor beneath her feet, and she thought about Julian's beautiful hands and the engineers' grey coats and the particular way powerful men dressed their cruelties in the language of care. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to plan. The library was locked, which told her everything she needed to know about what it contained. She waited until the Abbey settled into its late-night rhythm. The engineers retired by 10, the butler made his last round at 11, and the building itself seemed to exhale somewhere around midnight, its steam pulse slowing to something almost restful. She had learned its schedule the way she'd learned the suit's language. Patiently, by feel. The lock was a simple ward mechanism, insulting really, and she had it open in under a minute with the thinnest of her father's picks. The library smelled of coal dust and old leather and something faintly chemical she couldn't immediately name. She moved by candlelight, keeping the flame low, trailing her fingers along the shelves until she found the section that didn't match. Newer bindings among old ones, spines without titles, the kind of deliberate anonymity that screams its own importance. She pulled the largest and spread it open across the reading table. The drawings stopped her breath. They were extraordinary. Page after page of precise, luminous draftsmanship. The suit rendered in cross-section, in elevation, in the kind of intimate anatomical detail that only emerges when an engineer genuinely loves what they're building. Annotations filled every margin in a handwriting she didn't recognize, small and urgent and brilliant, describing a system of pressure regulation designed to support a damaged pulmonary structure, to assist a spine that could no longer bear its own weight, to keep a man functional and mobile and, the word appeared 3 times, underlined, comfortable. Comfortable. Someone had cared about that. Had written it down and underlined it and meant it. She turned to the back pages and found the signatures. 6 names, witnessed and dated. She recognized 2 from the brass plates outside the Abbey's West Wing offices. Aldrin. Hess. The same hands that came at 2 o'clock every afternoon to wind the springs tighter. She sat for a long time with the blueprints open before her and the candle guttering softly and the chemical smell finally resolving itself in her mind. It was the same lubricant they used on the suit's joints, embedded in these pages from repeated handling. Someone had been consulting these plans regularly, not to follow them, to find, with surgical precision, exactly where they could be reversed. She brought the blueprints to him at midnight. Not copies, the originals, rolled under her arm with the casual confidence of someone who had decided that caution had already cost enough. She spread them across the workshop table without preamble and set the candle at the corner and waited while he looked, the suit's resonator producing nothing for a long time, which she had come to understand was the closest Nathan Thomas got to being speechless. "Where did you find these?" he said finally. Not a question exactly. More like a man confirming the shape of something he'd long suspected in the dark. "Your library has a very inadequate lock." She smoothed a corner of the page. "Who designed this?" A pause. "I did. With a physician named Caro, before Caro was persuaded to leave Highspire." The resonator flattened the words but couldn't entirely strip them of what sat underneath. "The suit was meant to give me back a life, not confine me to one." She had known it, reading the blueprints. Knowing it and hearing him say it were different things entirely. Nathan looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked at Julian. Whatever Julian had prepared for this evening, it had not included this. The rehearsed grief was gone, stripped away cleanly as a panel with the wrong gauge screws, and what remained underneath was considerably less elegant, a man running rapid calculations and finding none of them landing favorably. He looked to Aldrin. Aldrin, for the first time since Freya had known him, looked at the floor. "The ledger," Nathan said quietly, to Freya, without taking his eyes off Julian. She produced it from her coat. He took it with steady hands and held it where the candlelight caught the columns of recorded pressure readings. Weeks of evidence, meticulous and irrefutable, written in the back pages of an inventory ledger by a watchmaker's daughter who had grown up understanding that the truth, like a good mechanism, only needs to be assembled correctly to speak for itself. Julian left before the Valley's magistrate arrived, which was perhaps the only intelligent decision he made that evening. The engineers were less quick. Aldrin stood in the workshop with the particular stillness of a man who has confused composure for dignity for so long he no longer knows the difference, and said nothing while Nathan spoke and the ledger was examined and the blueprints, Freya's retrieved originals, were laid beside them for comparison. By morning the West Wing offices had different names on the plates. It happened gradually after that, the way real transformations always do, not in a single dramatic gesture but in the quiet accumulation of correct decisions. The Abbey's workshops opened. Caro was located and returned. The Valley's engineers came not to extract but to build, drawn by the particular reputation of a place where problems were treated as puzzles rather than inheritances. Nathan found her one evening in the workshop, bent over a commission her father had forwarded from Oak Haven, a complicated marine chronometer, badly water-damaged, requiring the kind of patient reconstruction that most wouldn't attempt. "You could have left," he said. "After the dismantling. You had no reason to stay." Freya set down her loop and considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. "The chronometer needed work," she said. "So did Highspire." A pause, small and deliberate. "So did you." Outside, the valley hummed with new industry and the Abbey breathed, evenly, steadily, without strain, and for the first time since she'd arrived through those iron gates with her father's tools hidden in her corset and her fears folded flat, Freya Clarke found she had no interest whatsoever in leaving. And that is the end of Freya Clarke's story. A woman sold as a debt and returned as a duchess, on nobody's terms but her own. If this story found something in you, go ahead and leave a like. It takes a second and it means more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to walk in halfway through. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next one drops. I'll see you at the next story.